Why does Bitcoin keep going up? The sequel. I have more to say. Upon further reflection, I have more to add to the video from yesterday. In the last video, we examined how there is only 21 million millionaires in the United States, and there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. We examined the question of why does Bitcoin keep going up from the perspective of the financial elite, the 1% of the 1%. Now I want to examine this same question from the perspective of the bottom, let's call it the bottom third of the world in terms of wealth distribution. The poorest people. Right now, across the world, people do not trust their domestic fiat currencies. They use them to transact, to pay the bills, to buy food, fuel, supplies, and so forth. But for several billion people in this world, they do not save their excess capital. They do not save the surplus labor that they produce in their domestic currency because they do not trust it, because they have had their government hyperinflate their savings away before. They have had their government implement capital controls or confiscate a portion of their funds from the bank or restrict how much they can withdraw from their bank account per day. They've had these experiences, and they do not save in their domestic currency. You know what they save in? The US dollar. For several billion people, the US dollar is the premier store of value. And it has been for a very long time in this world, for decades. I was listening to the podcast by Pete McCormick, great podcast. He was mentioning a couple things that I would like to share. First of all, he mentioned something about when he was in Cambodia, he noticed that people in Cambodia save in the US dollar. But it's not just that they save in the US dollar. It's that they demand that the US dollar bill is pristine. They don't want it wrinkled, they don't want it folded. They want a pristine bill. That reveals something. That reveals that what people really want in their chosen store of value is for it to be pristine. They want pristine collateral. They want for it to be pure. And that manifests itself in this interesting little quirk where, a crumpled dollar bill is still the same as a pristine one. But in their minds, this is their pristine savings. This is their precious savings. They want it to be stored in a form that is pristine and precious itself. And right now, for several billion people, that is the US dollar. I'm aware of another anecdotal report from Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe is in, yet again, the clutches of yet another hyperinflation that is currently unfolding. And the government's response in Zimbabwe has been tight capital controls, price fixing, and so forth. And the people's response in Zimbabwe has been there's apparently a thriving Bitcoin market in Zimbabwe, a flourishing Bitcoin market in Zimbabwe, because people in Zimbabwe are looking for a store of value to hold their savings, their precious savings. And increasingly in Zimbabwe, reportedly, it is not the US dollar. The The US dollar still is being used, yes, as a store of value in Zimbabwe, absolutely, as a medium of exchange as well. But so is Bitcoin. Bitcoin is rapidly encroaching upon this market share, this demand for a store of value that cannot be destroyed by the domestic government. And of course, when I talk about the US dollar, I'm talking about physical bills, because of course the government can't just lock people out of the physical bills, because there's no counterparty risk when you hold it yourself. But in Zimbabwe, Bitcoin is becoming a premier store of value. Also, what I've heard from Zimbabwe, the Bitcoin market, there is a premium, a price premium compared to the rest of the world of something like 10-20%. So when you have government restrictions, capital controls, things like Bitcoin perhaps are illegal. When governments try to kill Bitcoin, the price goes up. I've mentioned this before. I don't have proof of this. I don't know for sure. But since Bitcoin has all but been banned in China, I guarantee you, I've said this before, this is just my instinct, this is my educated guess, but I guarantee you that there is still a Bitcoin market in China, and that it trades for a premium. But the more you try to lock down and lock out people from storing their savings in a form that is sheltered from the manipulation or confiscation or destruction by government action, the more you try to block people out, the more it signals to people that they must protect their capital by getting into that asset itself. If your government bans Bitcoin, that's a pretty good indication that you better get into Bitcoin, because there's a reason that they're banning it, because they're coming after your savings, your money, your capital. They're coming after it, and they're trying to block you out of any way of protecting it. Now, just to get back to the subject of the US dollar being used as the premier store value for about a third of the world's population, that says a lot about how much people trust their own governments to manage their fiat currency, their domestic currency. Essentially, what people have done is outsourced that responsibility from their domestic government to the US Federal Reserve. But what happens to the US dollar being used as a store of value for a third of the world if they no longer trust the Federal Reserve to manage the US dollar responsibly, to maintain its purchasing power? What happens when a third of the world who currently save their excess wealth in the form of the US dollar, who provide demand for US dollars across the world, what happens if, for whatever reason, this huge cross-section of humanity decides that they no longer trust the Federal Reserve either to manage their chosen store of value, the US dollar? What happens if that trust is lost? What happens if, for some reason, the US Federal Reserve decided to print US dollars just in the trillions? What happens if money printing in the United States goes just totally off the rails and just start printing US dollars with wild abandon? And what happens if that third of the world who have used the US dollar as a trusted, pristine store of value for years, for decades, even for generations, what happens when people catch on to that and they realize that the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government are essentially taxing them. They are taxing the world, because that is what, when you print dollars, you are taxing the people that already own them. Inflation is theft. It is a form of taxation. And when the U.S. prints U.S. dollars like it has been recently, eventually the net effect of this is that they are taxing the purchasing power of everyone that holds U.S. dollars. Now, what happens when someone in Cambodia, in Zimbabwe, in Argentina, in El Salvador, what happens when they start to notice this taxation? Because it's always been there, lingering in the background, but it was always almost as if it was a fee, an acceptable fee. If you're in Zimbabwe and there is 2% inflation for the US dollar per year, compared to your domestic currency, 2% is a fee essentially that you are glad to pay. But what happens if that so-called fee, what happens if inflation, even for those overseas, starts to become not just noticeable but detrimental? What happens when people, that third of humanity that uses the US dollar to store their precious savings that has perhaps taken years for them to earn? What happens when they no longer trust that store value? They are going to search for an alternative. They are going to turn to an alternative. And they already are. The alternative store value has already been selected, is being selected by people, the poorest in the world, all across the world, and it's Bitcoin. Whether it's El Salvador, Argentina, Zimbabwe, or there's dozens of other countries I could name. People are using Bitcoin to store their savings, to protect it from their domestic government, in lieu of the US dollar, as an alternative to the US dollar, as a rejection of the US dollar. In the last video, we were talking about what if all the millionaires in the world decided to start buying Bitcoin. Well, forget them. Who cares? Just exclude that even as a variable. What if just that 1/3 of humanity decides that they want a better store of value than the US dollar, that they no longer trust the Federal Reserve to manage their savings, and they reject the US dollar, they abandon it, and they turn to Bitcoin? What happens to Bitcoin's price when you have 2 billion people over the course of not a very long time in the grand scheme of things, just a couple years, maybe a decade, migrating to Bitcoin as a store of value? We can't even, these are numbers. There's not even a point in crunching these numbers in US dollar terms. There's not even a point in doing a price prediction. You know why? Because any price prediction that we give is in fiat dollars. Fiat dollars that are being abandoned, that are being rejected, traded for Bitcoin. So what happens to the value of the US dollar as the world abandons it and trades it for Bitcoin? So you can see why there's not even a point in measuring this outcome in US dollars, precisely because the very event that is occurring is the abandonment of the US dollar. So why does Bitcoin keep going up? Where is the buy pressure coming from? It's coming from the top and the bottom, from the richest and the poorest. It's not just that it's coming from one or the other. We are at the very same time, we are seeing buy pressure increase from both segments of humanity, from both economic poles simultaneously. Now, I'm going to wrap up this video, and I'm going to ask you a somewhat rhetorical question. To the extent that the third of the world, the poorest third of the world, is turning to an alternative to the US dollar. And I think that increasingly that is happening, and that will increase as faith in the Federal Reserve's management of the purchasing power of the US dollar just not only declines, but perhaps in the near future we see it collapse as that faith begins to crack and crumble and perhaps to collapse. People will turn to an alternative. And let me ask you, here's the question that I will leave you with. What will that alternative be? What will that alternative be when, at this point, almost everyone in the world has a smartphone and or access to the internet? Is it going to be gold? Is it going to be Bitcoin? Why does Bitcoin keep going up?